Hey guys, welcome to this final video in the language revision series where we're going to continue looking at the debate over where non-verbal behaviour comes from. Is it innate or is it learned? This video is going to focus on the argument that it is learned. We're going to look at some evidence which supports the idea that non-verbal behaviour is learned. We're going to look at the key study by Yuki and we're going to evaluate Yuki's emoticon study as well. So this debate going through so far, is non-verbal behaviour innate or is it learned? What these basically mean is that the innate argument is that non-verbal behaviour is genetic. It's, the skills, the behaviours are present at birth and we have not learned them. So we're born with the ability to use facial expressions and gestures and understand about personal space and posture and stuff. There is the argument, though, that non-verbal behaviour is learned, which basically means that we have developed these behaviours through experience and they were not present at birth. So this is very opposite to what Darwin said in the last video. So what's the evidence out there that's which shows us that non-verbal behaviour is learned? Well, the first piece of evidence is to do with gestures. So gestures, we're talking about hand gestures, mostly. It could also be like nods of the head and stuff like that, but mostly hand gestures. And the idea is that different cultures use different gestures for different things. So we can take the same gesture and use it in different cultures and it will mean different things. Now this suggests that we have learned to use this non-verbal communication, the hand gesture, from our culture. And the fact that every culture does not use it in the same way suggests that it is a learned behaviour. Take, for example, the gesture you can see on the screen now. That in the UK is the OK gesture. It means, yeah, all good, everything's okay. If you were to take that gesture and use it somewhere like France, it would actually be quite insulting. The symbol represents a 0, which they would interpret as, you're saying that what they've done for you is worthless or has no value. It's rubbish. It's not very good. So if you put that sort of symbol up to somebody, you would either be saying that you're not good, you're worthless, you're feeling not great, or you would be criticizing something that they've done for you. So, the fact that different cultures look at gestures in different ways suggests that this non-verbal behaviour has been learned. The second example is from personal space, and it's the idea that different cultures have different preferences for personal space. Some cultures are quite happy being quite close to each other. Other cultures need more room, more distance to feel comfortable. And again, because this is different from culture to culture, it would suggest that we have learned to feel this way. For example, psychologists have done observations on English people and Arab people having conversations, and we have identified that English people tend to need a little bit more space to feel comfortable, a little bit more distance than Arab people, suggesting that this difference has been learned. Now, the key study for this section comes from Yuki and the emoticon study. And Yuki wanted to see if culture affected how we interpret emotions. And if it does, then that would suggest that we have learned to interpret emojis and emoticons and facial expressions from our culture, and it is not an innate thing. So what Yuki did is they got some Japanese and American students and they showed them a series of emoticons. Now, these emoticons were special because they were made up of happy, neutral, and sad eyes and mouths. You can see a couple of these emoticons on the screen there. And basically, Yuki just asked the participants to rate how happy they thought each face was. So you can see some of the mouths looking sad, neutral, or happy, and the same for the eyes. Now, what was really interesting in the results is that Yuki found that the Japanese students gave higher happiness ratings to the emoticons with the happy eyes, suggesting that Japanese people focus on a person's eyes to determine how that person is feeling, whereas American students gave higher happiness ratings to the emoticons with happy mouths, suggesting that Americans tend to focus on the mouths to determine a person's feelings. So this is a clear evidence that different cultures have learned to interpret facial expressions differently. So really good, strong evidence for the idea that non-verbal communication is learned, especially our perception and processing of non-verbal communication. So it's a really good, really nice study by Yuki using emojis. If you use emoji in the exam, you'll be fine. Don't worry about the word emoticon. That's just what they used to be called before it got shortened down to emojis. Now, in terms of evaluating Yuki, if you got the question to evaluate him, let's run through some of the ideas of things that you could talk about. Let's start with some negatives. So firstly, the idea of processing an emoticon is very different to processing an actual face. So there is arguments to be had here that this is quite an unnatural task, and therefore the ecological validity is low and the behaviour may not actually be valid. So you can go down that route. It is a lab study, so therefore you can go down the basic lab evaluations. The argument that we can talk about emotions now and how people process them is very limited to just happiness and sadness, really, because Yuki only tested the perception of happiness and sadness, so we can't really generalize these claims to other emotions. We can't go around saying that we've learnt to process anger in different ways because Yuki didn't test that. You could also criticize the sample because the sample is just restricted to US students and Japanese students. So again, we may have some generalization issues. Now, on the positive, being a lab study, is the idea that it is highly controlled and it is replicable, and it has been repeated, and it has been repeated with real faces, and it actually got the same results. So you can go down the route of talking about the strengths of a lab study, and you can also talk about the fact that it has been repeated with real faces, suggesting that actually the behaviour is natural, and even though that Yuki used emoticons, it has been repeated with a more real, natural task, and that's obviously a really good thing. Now, finally, Yuki's theory links quite nicely to a previous topic, because Yuki looked at the differences in perception between two different cultures. So there could well be a linked question here at some point in the future between Yuki's study and the perception theories. So we got to, it would really help if you could identify which perception theory is being supported by Yuki's emoticon study here. And you'd be choosing between Gibson and Gregory. Gibson, who says that perception is innate, and Gregory, who says that perception is learned. And if you thought about Gregory's constructivist theory, you would be correct. So Yuki's study does support the idea of Gregory's constructivist theory. This is because that Gregory says that perceptions are learned, and Yuki is showing from his study here that we learn how to perceive facial expressions. So, from our culture, we will learn to perceive either a person's happiness based on their eyes or their mouths. So good support for Gregory's constructivist theory. Alright guys, that's the last video of the language topic. That's everything you need to know. So we have just covered the idea that non-verbal behaviour is learned, looking at Yuki's emoticon key study and the evaluation there.